Some calls don't sound like cries for help. They sound like something waiting to be found. The road cut through the forest like a thin scar, quiet and forgotten, stretching miles beyond the last gas station Caleb Warren had passed nearly an hour ago, and the night had settled deep and heavy over the land, the kind of cold that pressed against the windows of his old pickup and crept through the seams like a memory that refused to leave, and beside him Rex sat upright, ears alert, amber eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, as if reading something written into the wind, and Caleb kept one hand loosely on the wheel, the other resting near the worn leather of the seat, his breathing steady but distant, like a man who had learned to exist without expecting much from the world anymore. The engine hummed low beneath them, tires rolling over cracked asphalt, until suddenly Rex shifted, not violently, not with panic, but with a quiet certainty that made Caleb glance over without thinking, and then the dog stood, placing both front paws against the dashboard, staring through the windshield, unmoving, and that was when Caleb saw it, a shape just beyond the edge of his headlights, barely visible, something metallic and still, half swallowed by weeds and time, and as the truck rolled closer, the outline sharpened into the rusted frame of an old transport vehicle sitting crooked off the shoulder, its tires long gone, its body leaning as if it had simply grown tired of standing, and Caleb would have kept driving. He had every reason to. Gas was low, money was lower, and nothing good ever came from stopping in places like this, but Rex let out a low sound, not a bark, not quite a growl, something deeper, older, the kind of sound Caleb had heard only a handful of times before, and it carried a weight that made his foot ease off the gas without him deciding to do it. The truck slowed, then stopped, engine idling softly as the night pressed in around them, and for a moment neither of them moved. Caleb staring ahead, Rex completely still, and then the dog jumped. Down before the engine even cut, landing lightly on the gravel and moving toward the vehicle with a focus that erased everything else, and Caleb sighed under his breath, reaching for his jacket because something in that silence told him he wasn't being asked, he was being led, and the air outside was sharp, biting through the fabric as he stepped down, boots crunching softly, the scent of cold metal and damp earth hanging low, and Rex was already there, circling the side of the transport, nose low, body tense but controlled, and then he stopped, just for a second, before lowering himself to the ground near the shadow beneath the chassis, and Caleb followed slower, his steps. Careful, his mind already preparing for disappointment or trouble or nothing at all. But then he heard it, faint, uneven, the kind of sound that didn't belong to machines or wind, something softer, something alive, and he crouched down, eyes adjusting to the dark beneath the vehicle. And what he saw made him freeze. 3 shapes pressed close together in the dirt, barely moving, their fur matted with dust and time. Their breathing shallow but present, and for a long moment Caleb didn't speak. Didn't reach, didn't even blink, because something about the way they lay there didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like waiting, and Rex lowered his head beside them. Not touching, just watching, as if he understood something Caleb hadn't yet found the words for, and the night seemed to hold its breath around them. The wind still, the trees silent, and Caleb exhaled slowly, a sound barely louder than the cold air leaving his lungs. As he realized this wasn't a moment he had stumbled into, it was one that had been waiting, patient and quiet, for him to arrive. Kindness is often quiet at first, almost small enough to ignore, until it asks you for something you're not sure you can give. Caleb stayed crouched there longer than he expected, the cold slowly seeping through his jeans, his breath rising in faint clouds that drifted beneath the rusted frame, and the 3 dogs did not move much, only the faint lift and fall of their ribs marking time in a way that felt fragile but stubborn, like something refusing to let go without reason, and Rex shifted slightly beside them, lowering himself to the ground with a care that bordered on reverence, his ears angled forward, his body still, as if he were listening not just to their breathing, but to something deeper beneath it, and Caleb reached out at last, slow and deliberate, his gloved hand hovering before it finally rested against the nearest dog's shoulder, the fur cold but not lifeless, and the animal did not flinch, did not pull away. It only opened one eye halfway, a dull amber that seemed to search his face without fear, and something in that quiet acceptance settled into Caleb's chest in a way he had not felt in years. Not since before the long nights and the empty roads and the way silence could sometimes feel louder than anything else, and he swallowed once, glancing at Rex, who met his gaze with a steady look that carried no doubt, no hesitation, only a simple truth, and Caleb exhaled slowly as he pulled off his jacket, spreading it carefully over the three bodies, the fabric barely enough to cover them, but more than they had a moment ago, and the night pressed closer, colder, as if reminding him of the miles still ahead, and the gas gauge already leaning too close to empty, and for a brief moment the old instinct returned, the one that measured risk and survival in practical terms, the one that said keep moving, keep what little you have, do not stop for what you cannot fix, but it did not hold. Not this time, because something about the way Rex remained there, unmoving, grounded like an anchor in the dark, made it clear that this was not a detour, it was a direction, and Caleb stood slowly, rolling his shoulders once as if preparing for something heavier than lifting weight, then moved to the back of the truck and pulled it open, the metal creaking softly in the still air, and he grabbed the old blanket folded beneath a stack of tools, shaking it out before bringing it back, kneeling again to wrap it around the three dogs as gently as he could, his hands steady despite the cold, and one of them shifted slightly, pressing closer to the others, and he felt the faint warmth beginning to gather beneath the layers, small but real, and he nodded once to himself without realizing it, as if acknowledging a decision already made, and one by one he lifted them, each lighter than they should have been, each carried with the same care he had once reserved for things that mattered more than survival, placing them carefully into the truck bed lined with what little padding he could manage. And Rex remained close, watching every movement, stepping up only after the last one was settled, positioning himself beside them as if taking his post, and Caleb closed the tailgate with a soft click before walking back around to the driver's side, pausing with his hand on the door, his eyes drifting once more toward the rusted vehicle. And for just a second the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic scent, and something else he could not quite name, something that lingered at the edge of recognition, and he frowned slightly, his gaze narrowing, but whatever it was did not reveal itself. Not yet. And so he climbed back into the truck, the engine humming as he turned the key, the headlights cutting once more through the darkness ahead, and as the tires rolled forward, leaving that forgotten place behind, Caleb did not look in the mirror, because something told him that whatever had begun back there was not something you left behind. It was something that followed, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment it would be understood. Sometimes the hardest part is not finding what needs saving, but choosing to keep saving it when the cost begins to rise. The truck moved steadily through the long stretch of dark road, its headlights carving a narrow path between rows of silent trees, and inside the cabby air carried a different weight now, something quieter, something fuller, as if the night itself had shifted to make room for what Caleb had taken on, and he kept one hand on the wheel while the other rested loosely near the edge of the seat, his fingers tapping once in a slow rhythm he did not realize he was repeating, and behind him he could hear it, faint but steady, the soft movement of breath layered upon breath, three fragile rhythms trying to find their way back into strength, and every few seconds Rex adjusted his position, the sound of claws against the truck bed light, but purposeful, never restless, only attentive, and Caleb glanced at the rearview mirror more often than he needed to, not to check the road, but to make sure that the shapes back there were still there, still breathing, still holding on, and after a few miles, he turned off onto a narrow gravel road that led toward a clearing he had used before, a place far enough from the highway to be quiet, but close enough to feel like it still belonged to the world, and the tires crunched over loose stone as the truck came to a slow stop beside a line of pine trees, their branches whispering softly in the wind that had begun to pick up, and Caleb shut off the engine, letting the sudden silence settle over everything like a blanket. And for a moment he just sat there, listening, because sometimes silence told you more than noise ever could. And then he stepped out, the cold sharper now, biting through the layers, and moved quickly to the back, lowering the tailgate with care, and Rex looked up immediately, his eyes catching the faint glow of the truck's interior light, and Caleb nodded once before reaching in, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the act itself required a kind of respect he could not explain, and he checked each of them, his hand resting gently against their sides, feeling for warmth, for breath, for any sign that the thin line they walked had not slipped away in the last few miles. And one of them shifted again, a slight movement of the head, barely enough to notice, but enough, and Caleb let out a quiet breath he had been holding without realizing it, and he pulled another layer from the cab, an old thermal blanket he had kept for colder nights, spreading it over them with care, tucking the edges in against the sides of the truck bed to hold what little warmth they could gather, and Rex stepped closer, lowering himself beside them again, pressing his body along theirs without hesitation, sharing heat in a way that needed no instruction, and Caleb watched that for a moment, the simple, unspoken understanding of it, and something in his chest tightened, not with pain, but with a kind of recognition he had not allowed himself in a long time, and he turned back to the cab, grabbing a small flashlight and a half-empty jug of water, along with a metal bowl that had seen better days, and he poured carefully, the sound of water hitting metal loud in the stillness, then slid it closer, though none of the dogs moved toward it yet, and he did not expect them to, not this soon, and as he straightened, the beam of his flashlight passed briefly over one of their collars, catching on something that reflected just enough light to draw his attention, and he paused, lowering himself again, angling the light more carefully this time, and there it was, worn but unmistakable, a small metal tag fixed beneath the collar, etched with lines too precise to be random, and Caleb leaned in slightly, his breath fogging the surface as he wiped it, gently with his thumb, revealing the faint outline of a symbol he had not seen in years, something tied to a place he had left behind but never fully escaped. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak, because the night had just shifted again, not with sound, but with meaning, and somewhere beyond the trees the wind carried a low, distant hum, subtle enough to be mistaken for imagination, but steady enough to be real. And Rex lifted his head, ears turning toward that direction, his body still but alert, as if the world had just whispered something only he could hear, and Caleb followed his gaze into the darkness, a slow realization settling over him like frost, that whatever he had picked up on that road was not only something he had chosen, it was something that knew exactly where it was going. Some truths do not arrive as answers. They arrive as memories you are not ready to remember. Caleb remained crouched beside the truck a moment longer, the faint symbol still catching the edge of his flashlight beam, and his thumb hovered over it, as if touching it might confirm something he was not yet willing to say out loud. Because it was not just a mark, it was a language, one he had learned years ago in places where silence meant survival and symbols meant direction. And he leaned in closer, his breath steady but slower now, tracing the lines with his eyes until recognition settled, in quiet but undeniable, and he exhaled through his nose a low, controlled breath that carried more weight than sound, because that symbol did not belong on something forgotten. It belonged to a unit, a program that had been shut down without explanation, a program that worked in shadows and left very little behind. And yet here it was worn into metal, still intact, still deliberate. And Caleb sat back slightly, his gaze drifting from the collar to the trees beyond the clearing, where the darkness felt deeper now, not empty, but occupied by something unseen, and Rex shifted again, rising to his feet this time, his ears locked in that same direction, his body angled forward with a quiet intensity that spoke of more than curiosity, and Caleb followed that line of sight, narrowing his eyes, listening, because the wind had changed again, carrying that same low hum he had noticed before, faint but consistent, like something mechanical buried beneath distance. And for a moment the clearing no longer felt like a place to rest. It felt like a place to pause before something continued, and Caleb stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, but his mind sharper now, more awake than it had been in days, and he moved toward the front of the truck, grabbing the small field bag he kept behind the seat, unzipping it with practiced ease, checking what remained inside, a flashlight, a spare battery, a folded map, a few tools, Nothing more than what a man carried when he expected nothing but still prepared for something. And as he closed the bag, he glanced once more toward the truck bed, where the 3 dogs lay beneath the blankets, their breathing still uneven but present. And Rex stepped down from the bed without being called, landing beside Caleb and looking up at him, waiting, not for permission, but for alignment. And Caleb gave a slight nod, the kind that carried more agreement than command, before turning toward the tree line, his boots pressing into the thin layer of frost that had begun to settle over the ground, each step quiet but certain. And the further he moved from the truck, the more that faint hum seemed to take shape, not louder, but clearer, as if distance had never been the barrier, only attention. And he slowed near the edge of the trees, his eyes scanning the ground, the trunks, the spaces between, searching for something that did not announce itself. And then Rex moved ahead of him, just a few steps, stopping near a patch of earth that looked no different at first glance. But the dog lowered his head, sniffing once, then pawing lightly at the surface, not digging, just indicating, and Caleb stepped closer, crouching again, brushing aside the thin layer of leaves and frost until his fingers met something solid beneath, not rock, not root, but something smoother, colder, and he cleared more of it, revealing the edge of what looked like a metal plate set flush with the ground, its surface weathered but intact. And along one side, nearly hidden beneath dirt and time, the same symbol was etched again, smaller this time, but identical. And Caleb froze for a second, his hand resting against the metal as if feeling for a pulse that was not there, and the hum seemed to settle into that moment, no longer distant, but connected, as if whatever lay beneath had been waiting not just to be found, but to be recognized. And he glanced back toward the truck, the faint outline visible through the trees, then back down at the plate, his jaw tightening slightly, not from fear, but from understanding, because some things were not accidents, and some paths did not begin when you stepped onto them. They began long before, and Rex let out a quiet breath beside him, steady and calm, as if confirming what Caleb already knew, that this was not where the story ended. It was where it finally started to reveal itself. Not everything buried is meant to stay hidden, and not everything hidden is meant to be feared. Caleb kept his hand on the cold metal plate for a moment longer, feeling the stillness beneath his palm as if it might shift or respond, but it did not. It simply waited, quiet and unmoving, the way things built with intention often did, and he let out a slow breath before brushing away more of the dirt along its edge, revealing a thin seam that traced a rectangular outline, just large enough to suggest a door rather than debris. And Rex stepped closer, lowering his nose to the surface, inhaling once, then pausing in that same focused stillness he carried when something mattered. And Caleb reached for the edge, his fingers finding a small recessed handle nearly hidden beneath the layer of soil. And for a second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because opening something like this was never just about curiosity, it was about stepping into whatever had been waiting on the other side. And the night seemed to lean in, around him, the wind easing just enough to let the silence deepen. And then he pulled, slow at first, the metal resisting with the weight of years before giving way with a low, muted shift, the sound traveling down into the earth like a memory being disturbed, and the plate lifted just enough for him to brace it open, revealing a dark space beneath, not empty, but structured, a narrow set of steps descending into shadow. And the faint hum he had heard before rose slightly, not louder, but clearer now, like something steady and deliberate. And Caleb angled the flashlight downward, the beam cutting into the darkness to reveal walls lined with concrete, smooth and intact, untouched by collapse or time. And he felt something settle in a place inside him, because this was not forgotten, it was preserved. And Rex stood at the edge beside him, ears forward, body balanced between caution and purpose. And Caleb glanced back toward the truck once more, the outline barely visible through the trees, the 3 dogs still resting where he had left them, their presence pulling at him in a quiet, grounding way. And he made a decision without speaking it, stepping back just enough to reach for the strap of his field bag, securing it over his shoulder before adjusting his grip on the flashlight. And Rex moved first this time, stepping carefully onto the first metal stair, his weight light but confident, and Caleb followed, lowering himself into the opening, one step at a time, the air shifting as he descended, colder at first, then strangely still, like a place sealed away from the movement of the world above. And when his boots reached the bottom, the sound was soft but final, and he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the narrow corridor ahead, the beam of light stretching forward to reveal a hallway that extended farther than he expected, lined with closed doors and old fixtures that looked more dormant than abandoned. And along the wall, faint strips of low lighting flickered weakly to life, not bright, not welcoming, but enough to outline the path. And Caleb exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, because whatever this place was, it had not simply been left behind. It had been waiting, and Rex moved ahead a few steps before stopping, turning his head slightly, as if listening for something deeper within the structure, and Caleb followed, his footsteps measured, his breathing steady, and the hum continued, not mechanical in a harsh sense, but rhythmic, almost like a pulse built into the walls themselves. And as he walked, his gaze passed over markings, labels, details that grew more familiar with each step, each one pulling him further into a past he had not expected to face again. And then he stopped, just outside one of the doors where a small panel flickered faintly beside it, the same symbol etched into its surface. And for a moment he simply stood there, his hand hovering inches away, because some doors did not just open spaces, they opened truths. And behind him, far above, the wind moved softly through the trees, as if the world itself had grown quiet to listen. Some doors do not resist because they are locked. They resist because they are waiting for the right hands to remember how to open them. Caleb stood still for a long moment, the faint hum surrounding him like a quiet pulse beneath the surface of the world, and his fingers hovered just inches from the panel, not trembling, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if he understood that what came next would not simply reveal something new, it would return something old. And Rex shifted beside him, stepping closer to the door, his nose lifting slightly, his ears angled forward with that same unwavering focus. And Caleb finally placed his hand against the panel, the surface cool but responsive, and for a second nothing happened. Then a faint tone sounded, low and almost gentle, followed by a soft glow beneath his palm, and the door released with a quiet click, not abrupt, not mechanical, but smooth, as if it had been opened many times before by someone who knew its rhythm. And Caleb pushed it inward, the hinges silent, revealing a room that felt untouched by time, not in the sense of neglect, but in preservation, the air still. The surface is clean, the structure intact, and the beam of his flashlight swept across the interior, catching on rows of equipment, old but maintained, monitors dark but unbroken, and along the far wall, a series of metal kennels, empty now, their doors open, their interiors lined with worn padding that spoke of use rather than abandonment, and Caleb stepped inside slowly, his boots making soft contact with the floor, and something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition, because this place was not unfamiliar, not entirely. It carried the shape of something he had once known, something structured, disciplined, purposeful, and he lowered the flashlight slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust as more of the room revealed itself. And on a central table sat a small stack of files, their edges neat, their presence intentional, and he approached, reaching out with a hand that remained steady despite the weight settling into his thoughts. And he opened the top file carefully, the paper inside aged but preserved, the ink still clear, and his eyes moved across the lines slowly, reading without speaking, each word pulling him deeper into a memory he had not revisited in years. And there it was, the designation, the same program he had recognized from the collar, the same unit that had disappeared without explanation, and beneath it, a list of names, handlers, assignments, and then, further down the page, a familiar line that made his breath pause for just a second, his own name, written in the same careful script, tied to a classification he had never fully understood even when he was part of it. And he closed his eyes briefly, not in shock, but in acknowledgement, because the past did not return by accident. It returned when it had something left to give, and Rex moved deeper into the room, stopping near the kennels, his gaze fixed on the empty spaces as if seeing something beyond what remained, and Caleb followed, his steps slower now, his thoughts shifting from confusion to clarity, because the three dogs above, the symbol, the hidden entrance, none of it was random. It was a path, one that had been set long before he had stepped onto that road, and he reached out, resting his hand briefly against one of the kennel doors, the metal cool and solid beneath his palm. And for a moment, the hum seemed to align with his own breathing, steady and grounded. And then he turned back toward the table, his gaze drawn to a second file that sat slightly apart from the others, its cover marked with the same symbol, but with an added notation, one he recognized immediately, not as a warning, but as a designation of importance, and he opened it slowly, knowing before he read a single word that whatever waited inside would not just explain why he was here, it would explain why he had been brought back at all. And somewhere above, beyond the layers of earth and time, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the quiet truth that some journeys do not begin when you choose them. They begin when you are finally ready to understand them. Some realizations do not arrive as answers. They arrive as weight, the kind that settles into your chest and changes the way you breathe. Caleb stood motionless for a moment, the second file open in his hands, the pages illuminated by the narrow beam of his flashlight, and the words did not rush at him. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if they understood that what they carried could not be taken all at once. And his eyes moved across the lines, absorbing fragments first, then patterns, then meaning, and what he read was not a report in the usual sense. It was a record, a continuation of something that had never truly ended. And the program he had once been part of, the one that had trained dogs not only to detect and respond, but to anticipate, to sense patterns beneath noise, had not been shut down as he had believed. It had been relocated, concealed, preserved beneath layers of silence and earth. And the three dogs above were not abandoned. They were released deliberately, placed where someone would find them, someone who knew what they were. And his grip on the file tightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of clarity, because the pages did not just describe the dogs, they referenced him, not as a former handler, but as a designated variable, a term he had not heard in years, one reserved for individuals whose instincts could not be fully measured, but had proven essential in moments where systems failed. And he let out a slow breath, his shoulders settling as the pieces aligned, and Rex stepped closer, his presence steady, grounding, and Caleb lowered the file slightly, glancing at him with a look that carried understanding rather than surprise, as if the dog had known this all along. And then he returned his attention to the pages, reading further, and there it was, the directive, simple and precise, if the program ever reached. A point where continuation required human judgment rather than protocol. The dogs would be guided toward a handler capable of choosing without instruction, and Caleb closed his eyes briefly, the words echoing in a space deeper than thought, because that was not a coincidence, that was intention, and he lowered the file onto the table carefully, his movements slower now, not from hesitation, but from respect, because what had been placed in front of him was not a task, it was a responsibility, and the hum around him seemed to shift, not in volume, but in presence, as if the space itself acknowledged the moment. And he turned, walking toward the far side of the room where a secondary panel glowed faintly against the wall, its surface more modern, less worn, and he approached it with a quiet certainty, placing his hand against it just as he had before, and the screen flickered to life, not bright, but clear enough to reveal a single line of text that appeared slowly, as if being written in real time, awaiting confirmation, and Caleb read it without speaking, his jaw tightening just slightly as the meaning settled in, not as a question, but as a choice, and behind him, Rex moved toward the doorway, pausing there, his body angled upward, as if sensing something beyond the ceiling, something above ground, and Caleb followed his gaze instinctively. The image of the three dogs resting in the truck, returning to him with a clarity that carried more than concern, it carried purpose, and he stepped back from the panel, not rejecting it, but not answering it either, Not yet, because some decisions required more than understanding. They required alignment. And he turned toward the exit, his steps steady, his pace measured, as if the direction ahead had already been chosen somewhere deeper than thought. And as he moved through the corridor, the faint lights guiding his path, the hum continued. No longer distant, no longer separate, but connected like a rhythm he had once known and was now remembering. And when he reached the base of the stairs, he paused for just a second, placing his hand against the wall beside him, feeling the structure, the stillness, the weight of everything that had been built and hidden and preserved. And then he began to climb, one step at a time, back toward the surface, because whatever answer this place held, it was not meant to stay buried. It was meant to be carried forward, into the open, where choices were not written, but made. Some choices do not feel like decisions. They feel like returning to something that has been waiting for you longer than you understand. Caleb emerged from the hidden stairwell slowly, the cold night air meeting him again with a quiet familiarity, as if nothing had changed above ground. Yet everything inside him had shifted into place, and the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost, grounding him in the present, even as the weight of what he had discovered lingered just beneath the surface. And Rex stepped out ahead of him, pausing at the edge of the clearing, his body angled toward the truck, his posture no longer tense, but purposeful. And Caleb followed, his boots pressing into the earth with a steadiness that had not been there before. And when the truck came fully into view, the sight of it felt different, not just as shelter, but as something holding the next step of whatever this had become. And he approached the tailgate, lowering it with care, the soft click of metal echoing lightly in the stillness. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at the three dogs, their bodies still wrapped in blankets, their breathing faint but more stable now, as if the time he had spent below had allowed something above to begin shifting as well. And one of them stirred slightly, a slow movement of the head, the faint opening of eyes that held more awareness than before. And Caleb crouched down, resting his hand gently against its side, feeling the warmth that had begun to return, and he exhaled softly, a quiet acknowledgement rather than relief, because he understood now that this was not a temporary moment. It was a continuation, and Rex climbed up beside them, positioning himself close once more, his presence steady and constant. And Caleb reached for the metal tag on the nearest collar again, the symbol catching the faint light as he turned it slightly between his fingers. And this time it did not feel like a question, it felt like confirmation. And he glanced toward the tree line, where the hidden entrance lay beneath the earth, invisible once more, as if it had closed itself to the world again. And he knew then that whatever answers remained below were no longer the ones he needed to find, because the real decision had followed him back to the surface. And he stood slowly, stepping away from the truck for a moment, his gaze lifting toward the open sky, where faint stars broke through the thin cloud cover, distant but steady, and the silence around him carried a different tone now, not empty, not uncertain, but waiting. And he reached into his jacket, pulling out the small object he had carried for years, the worn army watch that had long since stopped ticking, its hands frozen at a time he had never bothered to fix. And he held it in his palm for a second before closing his fingers around it, then placing it back in his pocket with a quiet finality, as if releasing something he no longer needed to carry. And when he returned to the truck, his movements were more certain, more aligned, and he opened the driver's door, reaching inside to gather what little supplies he had left, water, a small kit, a few tools, not much, but enough, and he brought them to the back, setting them down carefully. And when the dogs shifted again, this time pushing slightly against the blanket, its body responding, not fully strong but no longer fading, and Caleb watched that for a moment, then nodded once, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words. And he leaned against the side of the truck briefly, his eyes drifting once more toward the direction of the hidden structure. And though he could no longer hear the hum, he felt it, not in the ground, but in himself, a steady rhythm that matched the quiet understanding settling into place, that this was not something he had stumbled into, it was something he had been brought back to complete. And as the wind moved gently through the clearing, rustling the branches overhead, Caleb straightened, stepping fully into the space of what came next, because some paths do not reveal themselves all at once. They unfold one step at a time, and he had just taken the step that mattered most. Some endings are not loud. They do not arrive with celebration or certainty. They arrive quietly, like a breath you did not realize you had been holding, finally letting go. The night had softened by the time Caleb settled beside the truck, the sharp edge of the cold easing into something calmer, and the forest no longer felt like a place of questions. It felt like a place that had already given its answer, and he sat there for a while without moving, his back resting against the worn metal, his gaze drifting between the three dogs and the dark outline of the trees, and Rex lay close beside them, his body relaxed now, but still attentive, the way he always was when something mattered, and the silence that surrounded them was no longer empty. It carried a sense of completion, as if the path that had brought them here had reached the point it was meant to reach, at least for now. And when the dog shifted again, this time lifting its head just slightly before letting it rest back down, and Caleb noticed the difference immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, a small return, a quiet step back toward life. And he leaned forward, resting his hand gently along its side, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. And he nodded once, not to the dog, not to Rex, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging something that did not need words. And after a while he stood, moving with a calm that felt different from the man who had stopped on that road hours before, and he gathered what little he had, adjusting the blankets, checking the water, making sure each of them was as comfortable as he could manage, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something that settled into him without resistance. And when he closed the tailgate again, the sound was soft, final in a way that did not end anything but simply marked a transition. And he walked around to the driver's side, pausing with his hand on the door as he looked out once more at the clearing, at the place where the ground hid what it no longer needed to reveal. And for a brief moment, he wondered how many others had passed by without ever knowing what rested beneath their feet. And then he let that thought go, because some things were not meant for everyone. They were meant for the ones who would recognize them when the time came. And he climbed into the truck, the seat familiar beneath him, the engine turning over with a low, steady sound that felt almost grounding now. And as the headlights stretched out across the path ahead, Rex lifted his head in the back, his eyes catching the light for just a second before settling again. And the three dogs remained still but present, their breathing stronger than before, their presence no longer fragile, but quietly certain. And Caleb rested his hands on the wheel, not rushing, not hesitating, simply ready. And when the truck began to move, it did not feel like leaving. It felt like carrying something forward, something that had found him because he was meant to take it further than where it had been left. And the road ahead curved gently through the trees, opening slowly into distance. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb did not feel like he was driving away from something. He felt like he was moving toward it, guided not by maps or plans, but by a quiet understanding that had taken shape in the stillness. And as the forest faded behind him and the sky began to lighten just enough to hint at the coming dawn, the world felt wider, not because it had changed, but because he had. And somewhere within that quiet shift was a truth simple enough to be missed, yet strong enough to carry him forward. That sometimes the things we think we save are the very things that return us to who we were meant to be.